Hi, I'm Jennifer Hinnell, currently a postdoc at the University of British Columbia, and my co-author today is Sally Rice, and we are coming to you from snowy Edmonton in Canada. Firstly, we'd like to express our appreciation to the organizers of this conference. They've put it together under very trying circumstances. And also, I want to say that we're looking forward to the Q&A session on Saturday in the multimodality session, where we hope to see some of you in person and get to talk. Our talk today follows previous corpus-based studies that we've done that have looked at the co-speech behaviors of very specific expressions in English. And this study is a little broader than the past work in that it's really a first look at the action in the body or the enactment or embodiment that accompanies larger chunks of discourse. Specifically, we're looking at gestures that go with certain types of listing constructions. So why study lists from a multimodal perspective? Well, there are a couple reasons. Firstly, we list all the time in conversation. Also, nearly any set of things or ideas can be thrown together into a list to exemplify an ad hoc category that's relevant to a specific speech context. So this means that lists involve highly contingent acts of categorization. What happens in a list that's formed in conversation is that a set of items are enumerated to demonstrate a sort of on-the-fly conceptual category. And most helpfully for our purposes in conversation, lists and listing expressions really do seem to trigger co-speech behavior, especially gestures. And this shouldn't be too surprising since human beings across cultures count and list on their hands. In the gesture literature, the focus has largely been on enumeration and finger counting in spoken language, especially from a developmental and cross-linguistic perspective. The gestures often go with very literal lists, like ingredients in a recipe, so items that are really specific. And finger counting embodiment is usually accompanied by phrases such as first. I mean, I can't even do it actually in a presentation with nobody in this room without saying first, second, third, or 1, 2, 3. We've also found these finger counting behaviors in many of the examples of lists that we've been looking at, but the types of lists we're looking at, the items in the list form more of a thrown together set than an exhaustive group of items or a sequence of steps in a process, like a recipe, for example. So what kind of lists are we studying? Lists are obviously types of categories. This is likely familiar to you from cognitive psychology and anthropology literature of the 70s and 80s. There is a lot of attention to lists per se in the conversation analysis literature in the 80s and 90s too. People like Gail Jefferson and Deborah Schifrin, among others, not only investigated listing language for what it says about spontaneous categorization, sometimes on the fly, but also how the dynamics of listing in conversation can extend a turn, reinforce something that was said earlier, or signal a turn completion. So in terms of what lists are conceptually, they do reflect, sorry, I'll advance my slide, they do reflect individual acts of categorization. So mentioned items are assumed to share features that these items have in common relevant to the context, but at the same time, these items, the categorization reflects some differences in those items. And since nearly any set of items could be construed as a category given enough context, it's more interesting and revealing actually to understand what lists are doing interactionally. So that's what I'll review briefly now. In terms of how lists function in conversation, there has been a long and growing interest in the CA community. But thus far, there are a few studies that have actually looked at list and interaction from a multimodal perspective, which is the tack that we're taking today. We want to take special note of observations in the CA literature that treat list making as really basic to conversation, not only from the standpoint of being created in conversation, but in featuring a number of characteristics that make them a bona fide unit of discourse that's worthy of study, much the same way that narrative has been looked at, for example. Lists are also basic in that they interact with a unit of discourse that is actually quite well understood, the TCU, or turn constructional unit. When speakers enter into a listing trope in the middle of a conversation, they're almost compelled to use particular syntax and particular prosody, and most importantly, to list at least 2 or 3 items so that their interlocutors know what they're doing. And by know what they're doing, I mean they don't interrupt until the list is complete. So you can see this in the case of the list spoken by Heather here at the bottom of the slide, Coke and popcorn and that type of thing. And also in this second one, the speaker knows exactly, or the interlocutor knows exactly what they can helpfully contribute in the second dialogue when Ken adds a third item to Louise's original list. They hit rain, then they hit hail, and then Ken adds, and then they hit snow. So you can see there the role of the listing in the turn constructional unit. From the CA literature, we know that three-part lists, like the examples that I just showed you, seem to be the most common type of list in conversation, particularly because of limited attentional resources, which prevents longer lists from regularly being constructed on the fly, and partly because three-part constructions can signal when a turn is nearing completion, like we just saw. Three-part lists seem to come in two flavors: a list of three like items that share a similar level of specificity, like they hit rain, they hit hail, and they hit snow, for example. Or a list of two items, two like items, wrapped up with a more generalized or vague or abstract third item, as in the first example, you can buy Coke and popcorn and that type of thing, where and that type of thing is the vague, abstract extender. And in the rest of this talk, we're going to be referring to specific three-part lists as XYZ lists, okay, where three list items are all specific. And then we're going to refer to mixed lists of specific, generic, or general three-part lists, and we're calling those XYN, where the N is that extender, the generalized extender. And these XYN lists bring us to the literature on generalized list extenders or list completers, which, and that kind of gives us a nice entry point to corpus-based work because we can search for these recurring expressions in corpus. So obviously, you can make a list out of just about any set of items like we've seen, given specific or given enough context, but you can't always get to that third item. And this is where people tend to say, you know, X and Y or something, and stuff or anything and everything, or blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And fortunately, there's a fairly large set of these highly conventionalized, generalized list extenders that speakers can draw from, and which, like I said, serve as reliable search strings for us when we're doing corpus work. And so this is a set of generalized list extenders taken from the CA literature. After illustrating, well, first I'm going to illustrate the phenomenon of how these lists, both the specific XYZ lists and the mixed XYN lists, how these are enacted, generally speaking. And then we'll report on a few corpus findings for constructions that we've investigated multimodally that have these generalized list extenders as that N item. Okay, so let's give some video examples first of the specific or XYZ lists. In the first video here, you'll see that the listed category seems to be something like food items for a TV star's dressing room. And so I'll play it and then add another couple comments.
He said, now, V, you gotta make a list. Now you gotta demand and ask for what you deserve. And I said, okay, like what? He said, you gotta ask for the Greek yogurt. And you gotta ask for the blueberries, and you make that organic blueberries, because you know I like organic blueberries. And you gotta ask for sparkling water, and not those little bottles, those big bottles of sparkling water. And I said, okay, Joyous.
Okay, so here you can really see that the cadence and prosody and syntax in those three listed items is very similar. And you can also see that the manual gestures for each item in the list are very similar, okay, with the same kind of amplitude and extension and the same form.
He said,
oh.
Now, me.
Okay, and if that went by a little bit too quickly, here are some stills that you can look at the three, as she's saying, the three list items. This next video involves a 4-part list, but since it's rather than this traditional 3-part list, but it's such a clear example of the phenomenon that we are exploring, and is actually the example that motivated us to look at generalized list extenders. So we wanted to show it to you here. So the speaker here is an avid vlogger. She uses a generalized list extender after listing 4 specific time frames in a repeating construction. So I'll play that for you.
I love you guys. Enjoy your day, enjoy your week, enjoy your month, whatever. I love you all very much.
Okay, so she's the specific time frames are in a repeating enjoy your blank construction. And the X, Y, and Z elements have receive the same hand shape and trajectory in the gesture, while the N element receives a different hand shape altogether, and it's the one that's frozen here in the screenshot. It's the generalized or whatever.
I love you guys. Enjoy your day.
And again, here are just some stills if you want to come back to it. In the next example, this is another X, Y, N list, and here the speaker's gestures are less elaborate, but note that the X and Y components both involve bimanual presentational gestures, first to her left and then to her right, and then the N on or whatever is smaller, the gesture is smaller and more central. So essentially it's just a lift of the left hand in a kind of inverse beat gesture.
The interesting thing today is that the Trump campaign, always says that Joe Biden is hiding his health record and he's hiding his brain surgeries or whatever. And I even think Maria Bartiromo asked him a question about it.
So like in the last examples, the first 2 gestures here on the specific items of X and Y are similar in form. And then the third kind of throwaway generic item has a weaker form of that gesture. So on the N, it's not the same as the X and the Y. That's the basic point. So like Adam Kendon and David McNeil and other researchers in multimodality, we assume that speech and gesture share a common conceptual underlay, and that we should really find correlations between what the body is doing and what the verbal expression is meaning. And so we are illustrating this here. In the case of our XYN list constructions, we anticipate that whatever the gestures are, if any, that accompany the 2 specific items in the list, the N, which is expressed by a generalized list extender, will feature a difference in the body signal. So that could be either a different gesture altogether, or a more attenuated or reduced gesture, or possibly no gesture. But really the bottom line there is the key. We're expecting same, different. So our research questions, what we want to find out was whether the data support this basic hypothesis, that specific versus generalized list items in spoken language feature a difference in their enactment, such that these X and Y elements are gestured differently than the N expression. That's the first and main research question. And we've noticed from our analysis of search returns in COCA that even calling these XYN lists is, even calling these XYN constructions list is a bit misleading. The elements being grouped together to form an ad hoc conversationally contingent category are all over the map in terms of their conceptual content, concreteness or abstractness, referential specificity, part of speech, phrasal complexity, et cetera, et cetera. So thus far, we don't have enough data collected to answer the second question about which of all of the factors that I just mentioned might affect the form of the gesture. But we do expect that variation in the nature of the linguistic expression will have an effect on the nature of the co-speech embodiment. Our third question is maybe a bit more schematic or overarching, and it's related to the first. It moves us away from what we'd like to know from question 2, where we're looking at whether individual expressions have unique profiles. And question 3 is about the construction as a whole, the X, Y, and N, and whether there are reliable and recurrent ways in which 3-part mixed lists are embodied. So our methods are as follows. As in previous work, we take a corpus approach. So we're not interested so much in anecdotal demonstration, although obviously in a conference presentation, that's part of what we show, but we want to bring it into the realm of quantitative analysis. And to do this, we use both the spoken subsection of the COCA corpus and the red hen database, which is based on the TV News Archive. Here, just briefly, I'm showing you search results from COCA, the spoken portion of COCA. These are the top 15 generalized list extenders and their frequencies. But I should qualify that in terms of the frequencies, we didn't dig into all 2,000 instances, for example, of or something to see whether these are actually used in 3-part lists or in lists at all. For example, in the case of whatever, some of the search returns feature or whatever, but not as a list extender, rather as a headless relative pronoun in something like he ordered a beer, some wine, or whatever everybody else was drinking, where or whatever is a headless heads a relative clause. So in the interest of time for this presentation, because we're only gonna show some results for 2 of the extenders with vastly different frequencies in COCA, we'll focus on and so forth and that kind of stuff. A brief background on red hen for anybody who's not familiar with it. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A. After we establish the search strings using COCA, then we can enter search strings in red hen and it returns time-aligned videos for us. In our annotations, what we did for this study was to find 25 usable examples. And what I mean by usable is that we can see the speaker on the screen with most of their body articulators and that there was a listing construction. And for the first pass through the data, we really looked at the degree to which the X, Y, and N elements were marked in the body. So that's this co-occurrence rate. And then we annotated the different body articulators in a fairly coarse-grained schema. So there are a couple different possible outcomes in the way that X, Y, and N lists can be gestured. Like I said, they can all be gestured the same way. They could all be gestured differently, but our hypothesis is that we're going to see this same different pattern, with the different being the N. And the N could receive a different set of gestures from the other 2 items in a few ways. It could receive a weakened version of the previous gestures, no gesture, or it could be expressed with a hold, for example, of the gesture that Y received, and we annotated all of these as different. So to give you an idea of the findings I'll start with and that kind of stuff. For this one, nearly 3/4 of the embodiments for the generalized N component were either weaker versions of the X and Y components or had no embodiment. So that's the 2 final lines of the table with the 12% and 60% respectively. And the ones in red are all of the C categories here conform to our hypothesis that there will be some difference in the embodiment associated with the N component and that kind of stuff. Okay, so here the take home is that largely the same different did apply. And I've got a couple examples that we'll just whiz through. In this video example, the N is different because it involves a static hold.
They have movies that you can watch while you're in the McDonald's, while you're waiting for your Big Mac and your fries and that kind of stuff. And there's some kind of a mix-up there.
Okay, and I'll just show you one more example for and that kind of stuff. Here, the gesture that the N element receives is virtually the same as what the X and Y elements receive. It's a continuative cyclic gesture. It's just almost off to the side of the screen.
Part of the problem was I found myself eating hot dogs and nachos and that kind of stuff a lot, which I love.
Right, but Chicago is the greatest town for that kind of food.
Okay, so just briefly to give you an idea of the findings for and so forth, they differed significantly from and that kind of stuff, which you'll remember is 72% was this same different category. And here only 45% of the embodiments conform to our hypothesis of this same different pattern. For and so forth, so the majority featured no gesture on the and so forth. Okay, so that's the last line, the 31%. And the other dominant pattern that accounted for 1/3 of the data was the same pattern. So I'm going to show you a few 2 final videos to show the same and then no gesture pattern, and also I'll show you the same weaker pattern.
And so he came down to visit. I was talking about my friends that were having all of these problems in their mouths and infections and pain and so forth. And we went through the town because I wanted to prove to him that this was going on.
Okay, so that was the same on Y. This is a 4-part list, so it was the same on Y and Z, and then there was no gesture on the N at all.
So many times we're not talking about those things because in order to talk about those things, we'd have to talk about policies with chemical companies and agricultural companies and oil and gas and so forth.
So on this one, the X and Y elements, X, Y, and Z actually, because it's another 4-parter, are gestured pretty much the same as the N element, and then and so forth is reduced in amplitude. The gesture is reduced in amplitude and moves to a more central neutral body position compared to the other 3 items. So this is an example of the same, weaker variety. And just to see it side by side, these are the findings. And now we have to admit these are very preliminary. We only looked at 25, but we really want to point out that the 2 generalized list extenders that we examined didn't, on the whole, behave the same way in their embodiment compared to other members. That the Ns, the generalized list extender expressions, didn't behave the same way as the X and Y to a large degree, 45% and 72%. But the fact that and so forth featured more cases where X, Y, and N were all gestured the same way may lie in the meaning of and so forth. So that suggests a continuation of the same. On the other hand, there were more dissimilar gestures for the and that kind of stuff, which as a phrase suggests more of an assortment. So these are slight differences, but they do encourage us that particular expressions will likely yield their own behavioral profiles. And this is in line with my recent dissertation work, where that was essentially the punchline. So there's some conversation that we need to have about whether generalized list extender gestures are recurrent. At this point, that seems like a tall hill to climb. On the one hand, we can say there's a certain stability and recurrence and conventionalization in listing constructions, and that they do tend to invoke co-speech gestures across the board, and they tend to involve 3-part gestural excursions. On the other hand, they also exhibit a lot of variation. So we kind of at least need to invoke Cornelia Mueller's caveat that while conventionalized, they are likely also locally shaped. So this is all very tentative for now, but there are strong similarities, like I said, with what I found in my dissertation research on contrast in particular, which featured a lot of symmetrical gestures sequenced bilaterally in gesture space. And that kind of behavior, so for finger counting and enumeration, the core behavior may be something as schematic as an articulator moving iteratively or sequentially in space. Yeah, so this bears more exploration. So to sum up very briefly, we need to look at more examples and different expressions, and also dig deeper into the nature of the items that are being listed, whether though they're nominal, deverbal, abstract, concrete, et cetera, et cetera. But we think it's fair to say that there are reliable and recurring differential enactments of N, at least for the 2 expressions we focused on today. For the second question, the jury is still out, but we expect to find some effects of list types and generalized list extender expressions. And finally, whether listing gestures or the listing routine as a whole can be a candidate for a recurrent gesture or gesture family, that remains to be seen, and we need to explore that. We leave you briefly with a set of quotes that I won't read out from Adam Kendon, but the main point is the more schematic the meaning, the more consistent the gestural form. Gestures often pattern with chunks of discourse and mark out the rhythmic structure of the utterance. And a key feature of a gesture may simply be its spatialization, such that different components of discourse are given different spatial locations. So that's what I was talking about with regards to the recurrent gesture. What is actually the schematic basis for that? So all in all, we feel encouraged by our findings and have a lot more work to do. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at our Q&A on Saturday.